that how to run it with groups that you might be affiliated with. Indeed, you might just want to run it with groups of families you're affiliated with as well. Or you might want to run it, if you're a teacher in schools, to run it with classrooms. You might want to have dedicated support groups where you have this model as a bit of a backup. If indeed you're a clinician, counsellor, psychologist, therapist, social worker, and you've got people who are directly affected, you could run it as targeted groups, so more like an intervention that gives you a bit more of a structure to use than just sort of open and free group therapy. So I really like the model. As Eamon said, I have used it and trained other people after the devastating impact of Christchurch terror attack. Prior to that, I've run it post-Iraq war. I've run it in Islamic schools. I've run it with teachers. Quite commonly, it gets run. A model like this does get run in schools when a critical incident occurs. I've run it after a child got hit by a car. I've run it after children within a particular family, Muslim family, passed away in tragic circumstances, and run it with students who were affected by their passing. The sort of it's a really interesting space to be in, but I think if you feel like you've got the heart for it and want to provide an intervention that's a little bit more communal as opposed to sort of individual support, then this is a really good one to use, and it's really easy to follow. And just a disclaimer, you don't need to be a psychologist or a counsellor to run this, but I will be providing as much information as I can. So, because the structure is really easy to manage, and I'll be providing information in the form of a PowerPoint. I might refer to it a little bit during our session today, but you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint, which refers to sort of a little bit more information about trauma, symptoms of trauma in children, how parents can be supportive, that I may not get enough time to go through today, but you'll have it there as a little bit of a resource. So if you're a teacher, for example, or you're a community worker and haven't really entered the trauma space, I think this is a really good easy model for you to run. And off the back of when we trained about, 15 to 20 people after Christchurch, there were varying levels of qualification and experience, but just really a sincere intention to be able to provide a service that can get to more people than just individual therapy. So on that, let's get started. Now I'm hoping, Eamon, if you haven't already got this, you can check your emails, but Eamon would have sent a model. So in just a PowerPoint, just a handout of the model. And that's what we're going to go through today. So give me one sec while I share my screen. Now, just before I do that, the way that we'll run is I'm going to run for about an hour, and then the last half an hour we'll try to go for questions if I'm tight with time. And so if you could just put your questions at the end. So when I say, all right, question time, just do a dump of all your questions in there, and we'll just try to get through as many as we can. Okay. And happy to support you after if you have other questions that we don't get to. So let's have a quick look at this model. Actually, we might go, bear with me. We are going to go to, just going to show a little bit of this first. All right. Okay. So when something terrible happens, our primary role is to help people to cope and return to pre-critical incident levels of functioning as quickly as possible by providing as many interventions as what we can. So such as counselling, psychoeducation, outreach, therapeutic group programs, including something that looks like critical incident stress debriefing or stress management. Now, our aim is to prevent long-term psychological consequences such as trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety in children or adults, and we want to minimise disruption to normal growth and development, because trauma certainly can impede on normal growth and development in children or young people. Now, that's a big ask. I don't pretend by any means that critical incident stress debriefing, is a panacea for all types of trauma, but I think there's merit in running groups like this to get to as many people as possible and to be present and start to normalize people's emotions. And then I guess when you go out into community, it also gives you a lovely opportunity as a referral point. So if certain people are struggling more than others, that they can be referred on to individual counselling or group programs, or just get a high level of support if they need to. Now, we can use this with lots of different communities. We can use it with groups of children. Obviously, they sort of need to be, you can run it for primary school children, as I have in the past. It just, you need to adapt your language, take your time, get parent consent, that type of thing. And also with young people tend to gravitate, although young people, just based on their developmental age, are a bit shyer to share emotions in groups. So the groups just might need to be smaller to create a little bit more intimacy and emotional safety for young people to share. But usually when one person shares, it's sort of a bit of a catalyst for lots of other people in the group sharing. And in these groups, whether it's young people or adults, not everyone needs to share. Actually, just listening to other people express some of what they feel goes a long way to validate what the quiet person in a group might feel as well. It can also be run with the elderly and more broadly in different community circles. Now, when is it ideal? Look, ideally, it's very useful to run it in the first 24 to 74 hours after a traumatic incident. Now, clearly, we're a little bit further away from the beginning of sort of the crisis in Gaza, I guess. But just to give you a reference point in the future, if you do use it in the future, I find that it takes a long time when we've got really large crisis on our hands, quite a long time to mobilize people, to get people into community to run something like this. But the more people that are trained, that you can often activate these circles quite quickly, and they don't take much work, and they capitalize on a huge amount of grief that people might be experiencing, and people want to, generally speaking, want to talk about it. All right, everything. One other thing I'd like to say about using this as an intervention for community groups is the nature of it being collective and trying to achieve a communal mastery. So these models tend to be more actually successful, in my opinion, with collectivist cultures where we tend to be a bit more interdependent and closer and tend to rely on other people for getting emotional support. And I think there's an idea that if we, for example, we the family are going and coping okay, then we the individual are going okay too. And if we can start to get that out to we the community, despite the level of the crisis, are doing okay, then we the community will be okay. And I think these are the sort of these subtle messages that you want to send through critical incident stress debriefing. I think it's also really important that in particular to the issues of facing Palestine at the moment, that we don't necessarily see as Muslims a separation between what's necessarily happening to the Palestinians to what's happening to Muslims more broadly. And because of that, I think that there's something quite beautiful around coming together as groups to deal with our collective grief, loss, sadness, trauma, about that. Obviously, it's important that even in a group setting, that we can try and amplify individual resilience in it, even just by a simple question like, what do you know about you in terms of your strengths that will help you to cope with this situation? Or what are some things that you've already been doing to cope with this situation that have been, even in the smallest way, helpful? And in that, so even in a group setting, we can still target individuals just by posing a couple of questions without detracting too much from the running of the model. Now, in the handout that you've got basically the overview of the model, which I'll just very quickly go through, but then I'll go through it in much more detail. This is about 7 phases. In the beginning, we're introducing and defining the purpose. So a little bit like what Eamon said at the beginning, this is not group therapy. I would say that very commonly, particularly in adult groups. And it's quite a structured process. And I'd be saying it's quite a structured process. There's a certain amount of questions, and You can think about it in your head, or you can share the answers out loud. Okay. You need to leave significant amount of time. I'd be thinking, depending on the group, 2 to 2.5 hours. You might want to take a break in the middle. I've never usually taken a break in the middle. It just depends on the emotionality that comes out in the group. You might need to take a break just to help everyone settle down. But I think that the groups tend to contain each other, and you can give permission for individuals, if they do get upset, to leave the group or the circle at any time and come back in. And definitely have a few boxes of tissues around. Now, I also, as a facilitator, I tend to have support people around me, so adult support people. So that could mean teachers, it could mean community workers, that if someone does get highly distressed within the session, that they're able to be supported or comforted by another adult coming in to sort of provide a little bit of support, or asking, does the person want a drink of water or something like that, or to go for a walk and come back. So phase 2 is information. So where we give as many details and facts of the event that we can. So you don't have to go into a lot of traumatic detail about what's happened, but it sort of depends on the nature of the event. I think you'd be careful. We don't, obviously, any sort of intervention that we're within trauma work can indeed be a little bit triggering, or a lot triggering for people. We've got to be really aware of that. So choose your details in terms of that you're going to present to the group. So because often after crisis, there's a lot of confusion about what's happened. So those questions, what happened, where were you? That could be, where were you when you heard that this incident or crisis was occurring? What role did you play? That's a more specific question for people who are directly involved, okay? Or are directly at a scene of an incident. And that's about as much as you'd get into that detail, okay? So you might want to go, well, this all, with regards to what's happening in Gaza, okay, it might have started on the, October the 7th as something's happened. And then just be clear maybe around the catalyst for the events. And I wouldn't give to, and then maybe I would, if I was working with adults in this scenario, I might give updated figures about how many people had been affected. And I also might get information about how the community group has been affected. Okay, so I might want to localize it too, to go, well, this happened, okay? And you could also use it, for example, let's just say there was some Islamophobic incident or some racist attack on someone local. And you could also, but it was in reference, or it was in the context of what's happening in Palestine. So a school's been, attacked or graffitied, or, or something bad's happened to someone locally. You could also run a critical incident stress debriefing for an incident like that within the bigger context. The third phase is the idea phase, which is really tapping into what people think about the incident. Okay, so what thoughts have you had about the incident? So the incident's here, and what have you thought about it? What did you think when you first heard about what happened? So you're really trying, and what you're doing is you're putting those questions out to the group to second, contributions. And you as the facilitator are just there to basically, acknowledge, thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's definitely something. So you're not really there to comment on what's being thought of. It's just really to notice, observe, at times provide some empathic statements to people who are sharing. And really your job is to hold the emotional space. And as you're moving through these stages, what you're also doing is totally observing everyone in the group. So you might have someone sharing, but you're watching everyone. You're watching for emotional reactions. You're looking for resonance in other people, where people are nodding their head going, yeah, that's exactly what I thought too, or that's what I'm feeling too. So when you're getting that, you don't then need to go around and go, okay, and what did you think? And what did you think? And you don't need that, because you're going to get just really some really common thoughts that, okay, most people have thought that. And it's a very slow process. So do not feel that you've got to really, jump through these. Your own emotional reaction to holding an emotional space in your body. And, that's one of the things that we'll talk about, is noticing your own emotional reaction as you're holding a space, is to hurry up. Okay, like everything speeds up when we get a bit stressed, including your thinking, your heart rate. And so a little bit of self-monitoring to go slow down, keep the pace as slow as possible so stuff can just come up and you can just process what you need to process. And the participants can process what they need to process without feeling like, and next, it's too abrupt. So the next phase, the emotional phase. This is probably the heaviest part emotionally, in terms of running this type of model for you and for the participants attending. And you're like, how did you react at first? How are you reacting now? What did you feel then? What do you feel now? And given that if you're running these circles, let's just say in the next few weeks, that's a really good one to see that there could be a shift, because you're like, oh my God, I was just so flooded with emotion and I went into action mode and I just went into all this advocacy or all this activism, or I was like constantly, responding back to people on Twitter or on social media and, battling away and, or I was supporting people, immediately overseas, or I was, supporting family members, or I was dealing with my overwhelming reaction, or actually maybe I was numb. Maybe I was numb to what was going on. Maybe I was minimizing like the gravity and the severity of this trauma. Like maybe I felt nothing to begin with. And maybe it took me like a week to realize how bad this was. And then I started to feel really overwhelmed and emotional because this was way bigger than what I had anticipated. And so how are you reacting now? So now there's a little bit of distance, and you might be going, okay, well now I'm feeling tired. Now this is like, there's so much more to do, and this is by no means over, and there's so much more, and I feel guilty. I'm not doing enough. I'm feeling just so weighed down. This is so heavy. Or maybe I've got glimmers. Maybe I've got glimmers of hope through this. So you may not always get negative emotions. You might get some positive ones. No, inshallah, like this, like inshallah, this will resolve. Or maybe it's deeper than that. Maybe there's some meaning that you're finding in this through through your spiritual connection. Maybe there's a settling there of going, yeah, this is really difficult. This is just an insurmountable test for people. This is, you're going to be characterizing it anyway, and so will the participants. Meaning phase. This is where we sort of look for evidence of distress. We start to go into that first part is just hearing thoughts, hearing feelings, and then we go into meaning, where we're trying to make sense. We're trying to make sense of what's happening, and we start to share a bit of information, as in we, the facilitator, start to share. So this process starts from holding the group to then transitioning the group to a bit of psychoeducation around, like everything you just said is really, like, considering the circumstances, really quite normal, as in a normal response to something traumatic. Okay, the event isn't normal by no means, but your emotional, psychological reaction to it is well within the space of normal. And that normalizing is really important. In the handout, I'll give you more information on the importance of normalizing, for people to go, all right, okay, despite me feeling these overwhelming emotions, this is within the range of normal. It's really important. People are there, we make meaning out of everything, and the type of meaning that we make will very largely contribute to how we cope with it. So, for example, if we start to say, this is the worst thing that's ever happened, this is horrible, and I can't cope with this, I just can't cope with this, then that's what will happen. Okay, so the meaning that we make out of something is really important. So this is where if your participants start to share a meaning that is unhelpful, you need to take note of that. Now, as a facilitator, you know, it's probably good to have a little notepad in front of you or iPad and just start to take notes of just common things, because you want to be able to hold the group, but you need to sort of take some notes because it might inform what type of things come out when you're moving into education, the education component of this. So meaning phase, how's this incident affected your life? What symptoms of distress are you experiencing? How has this affected your family, school, your health, as it might be, friends, workplace? Yeah. And then you're moving into the education phase. So assisting people or participants to identify helpful coping strategies. You know, how have you coped with difficulties before? And that's a really important question, because what you're doing is you're accessing people's resources at other points of adversity. You know, when you've had a really challenging time in the past, how have you coped with that before? Even if it's not the same type of challenge, you're just going, how have you coped? And that's really quite a helpful mechanism, because sometimes we do get stuck for helpful coping mechanisms. So by sharing that in the group starts to teach each other about what they're doing. So you might get someone to go, well, I'm praying extra, I'm making lots of dua, or I'm spending more time with my family, I'm spending more time at home, I'm staying off social media for a bit, I need a break. Okay, and they start to share. So rather than, you know, you, the teacher, you, the counselor, coming in to tell our, you know, participants how they should be coping, try to use the group to share. And by all means, if the group is a little bit quiet, you can go, you know, there's nothing bad about you know, giving some ideas or sharing as well. Giving people ideas about what they're doing to cope right now, even if it's in the smallest of ways. Getting good sleep, keeping up a routine, being around other people who, you know, get you, people who understand what you're going through, just sharing space with them. Okay. Positive activism is another way that people are coping. And kids can do that as well. They can do that within their schools or within their families. And I think there's been some really lovely examples of that on the internet as well, of children in their own activism. And then closure. So reminding people of their strengths. If you're working with kids, you might want to use something like strength cards. You know, you can add creative elements to this, which we'll talk about in a minute. Reassuring them about the things, firstly, when they're not over, that we don't expect people to just, okay, attend this debriefing and now they're going to feel good. And I think the difference between running a debriefing in the middle of a war is that the war, you know, sometimes wars haven't finished yet. So it's not a specific event like, you know, kids in a car accident, which has had a beginning and an end. And then the healing process is a little bit clearer. With this, it's not clear. It's not clear. You're getting people where we're still all in the middle of it and it's not clear. And so then your focus really then goes to, well, who's going to be there to keep supporting you? Yeah, and getting people to really start looking at things like referral, or if you're working with other organisations like within schools or within community groups, to maybe do this a couple of times. So for example, there's absolutely no harm in coming back, let's just say, God forbid, in a month's time or 2 months' time, and we're doing this again. So you might be doing this again with the same group, because the situation in itself hasn't necessarily ended. Inshallah, it ends, but it may not have ended. Yeah. I just want to come out of here for a second. So this is the handout that you've got. And it gives you a little bit more information about what you might say. So I'm going to go through it once and I'm going to go through it again. Okay, but I'll skip if I've covered anything. Now, this handout, I think I've given it to you as a Word document, hopefully. But what you can do is this is a document that I would use, and that it's a template. And so if you need to do this again, or you're planning to do it, that you would print this out, and that you would put the nature of the incident in. You might put the date the incident occurred or the period of time. You might need to put community members impacted. Now, you do that if you've got specific names for people. So say within the context that there's a family that are directly affected. So there's a loss of family members, there's a loss of that are in Gaza, and that affects your classroom, for example, or it affects your community group if people have been stuck in Palestine. You'd be doing it for people who are directly, like students in a classroom who are stuck in Palestine, okay, or who have passed away in Palestine. You might want to, then you can target this, because then the class are directly impacted. If you've got no direct victims and you're looking at indirect victims, then you just might want to go community broad. Yeah, it might change the nature of the way that you run the debriefing. Now, you might start by going, thank you for joining our debriefing circle today. It's a structured process. Hopefully everyone will have some time to respond to the questions that I might pose. Today, there'll be lots of listening to each other. Emphasize being supportive of each person's sharing, that they don't need to share if they don't want to, that they can just sit there and listen. Acknowledging that they might feel emotional during the session, that there's boxes of tissues and also that they could leave the room. Now, that obviously clearly depends if they're children and rules in schools and that type of thing. But ideally, you'd get some support where kids, if they were kids or teenagers, could absolutely leave the room if they were feeling a bit uncomfortable or it was too much. We don't want to, hold people in the room if their body is responding in a way that they need a walk. Then we encourage them to walk. Now, we could encourage them to come back in, but there's just no compulsion in a space like this. I have actually run this for also, if you're thinking, how does this run for both, males and females? I think it runs really, really well. I've run it where there was a really dominant male group of young people as well. And it actually runs quite well. Once you get a couple of the, young guys sharing, it's like they all do. And I've definitely had young guys get really emotional and upset in the group too, which might be surprising to you, but it certainly happens if you're holding the space well and you get one or two that lead their emotional contribution, in the group, which is fabulous when it occurs. Difficult to hold, but really, really important work that you're doing there if you can achieve that. Let me just have a look through. Now, to support you in the reaction and symptom phases, so 4 and 5, you've been sent, if I can just find it, you've been sent a feeling word vocabulary and also a sensation word vocabulary. They're really important because sometimes and you might sort of distribute that amongst the group when you're asking for people in terms of sharing how they feel. When people are really overwhelmed, there's a very naturally shutting down of our prefrontal cortex, and sometimes we can't access words. And so having sort of a bit of a checklist in front of people makes it really quite easy for people to go, yeah, like that's what I'm feeling on the sheet. They can see it, and it helps them to then be able to articulate how they feel and sort of overcome the very natural process of stress. So you've probably all got that. Just show that. No, not on that. see that. So that's one thing that being sent. So as you can see, that's a lot easier for people. And even if you just have a look at that right now, and then just have a quick flick about how you might be feeling. It could be despairing, devastated, could be threatened, worried. Now for children, you might shift that. You might just, if you just Google, vocabulary for emotion for children, you'll get some easier words there. This one's for adults. And secondary school students you could use it for as well, but I think for children you just need a child-friendly version of that. So I've also given you here. So this is a different vocabulary because not everyone feels, a feeling as such. They might feel a feeling and not be able to name it, but sometimes stress hits the body. I'd say very often stress hits the body, particularly stress that's a little bit ongoing. And so some people might start to somatically express, how they're feeling. And so people may not put the dots together to go, actually, yeah, I've had this like ache in my shoulder, or my lower back's playing up, or my stomach issues are playing up, and not necessarily see the realize that there is a connection between sort of ongoing stress and sensations in the body as well. This is a really good one for children as well. You might find a child-friendly version of this, but children often somatize their feelings anyway, and they might go, I've got a stomach ache, or I feel yucky, or I've got a cough, or so just for kids, it might show up a little bit differently, and they may not go, well, I'm feeling despair, because they may not necessarily articulate that, but they might tune into what their body is telling them. Okay, in the teaching phase, you might be sort of more looking at what are common responses to things like trauma, and important for you to know if some people have been directly impacted by an event, or if they've got family members overseas that have passed away, and they've been exposed to a lot more detail of stories about what's happened, particular details, and or if people have been exposed to seeing, some pretty devastating imagery, videos online. And I think, this is, if we're working with parent groups, that could be something where we're doing a little bit more psychoeducation around what kids, can handle, and what's going to be just too much for them to be witnessing. What you see, you can't unsee, and to explain that. And so if you're running parent groups, you might be just doing, like I said, a little bit more psychoeducation about how to help them to support their children. Because if you've got parent groups, often one of their prime worries is, what are their kids seeing? What are their kids feeling? And so that could be really useful too. And it's important for you to know what stress and trauma looks like if someone in your group is actually presenting with post-traumatic stress symptoms. So if someone starts to share how they're feeling, or sensations or symptoms that are coming up in their body, and for you to know what might hit the cluster of, say, a group of anxiety symptoms that actually might meet a criteria for an anxiety disorder, or for post-traumatic stress or acute stress responses, to know what they look like. Because if you do hear it and pick it up in the group, you don't need to triage it then and there, but what you would be doing is, for duty of care, is making sure that you can come up to that person later and say, hey, I notice some of your symptoms, wow, what you're going through seems a little bit heavy, and to then provide some referrals for individual support. And so we don't have to provide that individual support, but we just definitely need to make sure that we're making a referral. If you were working with a group of students and didn't get that opportunity, then you might speak to a teacher or the school counsellor if you're going in as a consultant. Or if you are a school counsellor and you are responsible for the groups that you're running, which can happen, as in just following it up directly with those students later and saying, hey, do you want to come and have a chat? I noticed that in the circle you mentioned XYZ. Come and have a chat about that, and we'll look at some strategies for you to manage that. In one of the last phases is the sort of re-entry, phase where you're sort of bringing the session to a close and sort of moving it. So after you've moved out of, talking about where students or participants can get extra help from, you're then going, okay, how do we move out of this space? And so what you might be doing is, you might be starting to help the group or encourage the group to start sharing what the group can do. And so if it was I've seen different examples of groups of young people saying, what if we plant a tree? What if we raise money for a charity organization? What if we send flowers to a family that might be directly affected? But there's some other ideas there. So it could be that as the group might decide to go to one of the protests, or meeting up with friends on the weekend to have their sort of own internal debriefing, which probably most of us have been doing anyway, or attending a Jummah prayer, making dua, and asking for the group to share their ideas, because they may well have had some ideas about what they want to do, but just haven't had a space to be able to offer that as a suggestion. Now, I'm just going to go back to it. Now, if you are running this with groups of kids under 18, whether it's in mosque spaces, youth groups, group therapy, or within schools, is sending a letter of information home to parents about the debriefing process. Ultimately, they need a consent for their children to be in it. Explaining beforehand to the teachers the debriefing process. I think that's really important. So you can get some really well-meaning support people, particularly if they're very used to leading classrooms like teachers, to come in and add information, or almost use it as their own debriefing in front of children, which you've got to watch for that, because then you're going to get a mix of both adult and child information. So I'd rather that you gave the teachers a space to debrief first, and that they're only there that they can be emotionally present for the kids, rather than seeing it as an opportunity to answer the questions on, as the facilitator's asking them. And similarly to other adults. So depending on who you're running it with, whether it could be community leaders that are meant to be there as support people, but again, just can't help it. They feel the need to vent as well. So word up your adults in the room that the process is for your participants, and support them on the outside. In terms of numbers, you can definitely run it with classroom size numbers. So if you're thinking about, you put a message out to your community through your platforms to run one of these groups, and then you get 50 participants respond to you, then absolutely try to break that down and to say, right, we're full at about 15. And if you've never run one of these groups before, I'd definitely say run it with about a group of 15 first. And, or it could be even less. You might just want to run it with 8. If you run it with a small group, it can tend to turn by default into a bit of group therapy. So unless you're experienced with that, just be mindful that the less the less numbers you have in your group, obviously the more time there is for people to share. So if you're thinking to yourself, I actually want to take the model and run it as group therapy, then keep your group sizes quite small. And if you want to run it where people are just answering the questions and you really hold to that structured process, then 15 to 25 is a great number to run it with, knowing that not everyone's going to contribute in the group. With children, you might want to shorten the length of it. So with adults, I definitely probably sit there for 2.5 hours. But with children, I probably stick to about 1.5 hours. So maybe, what's that? One period, 2 periods max. Utilizing, community or school counselors or find support people. You'll need other people in the group with you. You're the lead facilitator, but you'll need other sort of practitioners with you. And I wouldn't advise, I just realized, I wouldn't advise that you have family members if you're running it within a school context, again, for the sort of the same reason that it can be quite hard for parents to sit there in that space and to not contribute. If you were doing it, take 2 of you into the school community and run a parent one and then run a student one, as opposed to having them joined. The exception to that is if you were running it with a group of families. If you're running it with a group of families, I'd be speaking to the adults first around giving time for the adults to talk about, how they feel, but I'd also be, looking at, how what they say might affect children. So again, even within groups of families, my tendency would be to separate, and have one for the kids in the family and then one for adults. Or if there were family members present, that they needed to be quiet and put them on mute while the kids have a go at talking. I think it'd work lovely in that way too. If you haven't already, so this is in the PowerPoint, as you can see, that I'll be giving you just to have a look through and look at how PTSD shows up. This is how it might show up in children, and it's not that much different for adults, but you can find that online. We can give you a handout for that as well. I'm just going to flick through because you can see this later. The only other thing, so I'm going to flick through just. Okay. I think one thing that we've all got to be careful of, and we're all probably affected by this anyway in some way, is vicarious trauma, which is an indirect type of trauma. So we're not there when it's happening, but our social media feeds are all being flooded by what's happening. And so in many ways, all of us are slightly vicariously traumatized. But in its true form, vicarious trauma is someone who actually starts to experience the symptoms of trauma as if they were there. Okay, so it's secondary exposure to trauma, and it means that you need to be demonstrating like the traumatic symptoms. So that's something for you yourself as the clinician or as the support person or facilitator need to be quite aware of your own reactions and maybe have your own debriefing first with someone that you trust, another professional, before you run an event like this or a method like this, because what you'll be bringing into the room is quite raw and really quite emotional, and you need to be holding the space as mindfully as possible and not being flooded by your own emotions of it. And not to say I'm all for being vulnerable with clients and with community groups, but this is one where you need to keep in check your own emotional reaction as much as possible so that you can hold and be present with the participants in the group. And at one point, you can be sitting there in the audience today thinking, I really want to be able to do this, but gee, I'm feeling so full myself. Then this may not be for you. If you're feeling really full and emotional and on edge because you're very emotionally affected by what's happening, and no one would blame you, it's to say maybe this process isn't for you, or maybe tag team with someone who feels a little bit more comfortable doing it or more certain about themselves doing it, and tag team and provide support to someone else who's running it if you felt like you just need to take a little bit of a seat back and watch how it run first before you put yourself in the driver's seat. A little bit more of vicarious trauma. So it's secondary exposure to a traumatic event, and it can occur from anything that I've mentioned there. So witnessing violent news, hearing or seeing people that are distressed, witnessing really anxious and distressed and grief-ridden relatives, overhearing really worried adult conversations, or even hearing the conversations that children are having right now can start to worry, parents. Seeing things that are totally uncensored that our eyes were not designed to see by any means, and yet we're being exposed to it. Graphic internet photos, videos, pictures, radio reports, anything where we're getting information about what's happening in great detail is very likely to have an effect on us. Okay. One other thing that I wanted to just mention is watching, which is a bit of an impact of vicarious trauma, but also just the heaviness and the weightiness of what's happening in Palestine, is compassion fatigue. And when I look at, some of our really active community members, I think that compassion fatigue just goes hand in hand. So we've got to really care for ourselves. So when we're dealing with a prolonged type of critical incidents, you've really got to have a process where you're looking after yourself so that you can keep looking after community. Bit of an 80-20 rule, 80% towards community, 20% for yourself. Keep looking after yourself, keep checking in with how you're going and how effective you're being as a helper, and then jump back in. And that's clearly a very privileged position to be able to do that, to be jumping in and out, of going into supporting other people. But it is something that if you have the opportunity to do it, we should do it. And so that we can keep going over the long run and try to be as sustainable as what we can.